Hi everybody, great to be here. My name's Justin Ridgewell, so I work for the Environment Agency and I am an advisor at the coast, primarily looking at delivering the Environment Agency's strategic coastal overview, and that really means that we sort of try to make sure that everything, all the management decisions at the coast are being made in accordance with the legislation and the relevant policies and plans that are in place, and that generally the whole overall direction of travel at the coast in terms of how we manage flood and coastal erosion risk and coastal change is in alignment with sustainable development principles and is generally sort of taking into account the important local data. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about. So the contents of my talk: legislation and policy, national strategy, national planning policy, shoreline management plans, coastal change management areas, and coastal transition and funding. Now I can feel some of you nodding off already when you're reading that list. But what's really important when we're talking about sort of community empowerment and decision making is understanding the framework and the hierarchy of legislation and policy and a strategy, and how it's set out at a national level and how it filters down and cascades down through sort of regional level to area communities. And ultimately, that's the most important thing, isn't it? That it translates into the right action and the right levers for getting things done at local level. But I think it's really important in terms of the objectives of the Climate Action Group and this community jury to understand that process. So I'm going to start by just highlighting, and this is kind of for awareness, two key pieces of legislation that set the legal framework for how we manage flood and coastal erosion risk and coastal change. First of those is the Flood and Water Management Act 2010, and it just sets out a whole load of provisions about how we manage risks in a sustainable way in terms of flooding, water, so that's inland and at the coast, and coastal erosion. And then there's a second piece of legislation, the Coast Protection Act 1949, which has its origins way back in 1949, so it's an old piece of legislation, but it has been updated by the Flood and Water Management Act in 2010. And its central aim is to sort of provide a centrally regulated approach to coastal erosion and how we address it. So it's just worth knowing that those two pieces of legislation set a lot of the boundaries for how organisations like the Environment Agency, Cornwall Council, and other decision-making bodies at the coast work. But again, ultimately, they are there to sort of set out a framework that delivers for communities. So drilling down a bit from those two pieces of legislation, the national policy context is set by DEFRA's Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Policy Statement. And that sets out a long-term ambition for a sustainable coastline around the UK. So addressing flood and coastal erosion risk in a sustainable way. And this is, yes, that sets out sort of aspiration, but it doesn't really tell us how we do things. So we have two pieces of key national planning policy guidance. National Planning Policy Guidance and the National Planning Policy Framework. And these describe a framework for how we do things, so they start to get a bit more descriptive. And at the coast, there's really a focus on sustainable development principles and coastal zone management principles, integrated coastal zone management principles. And what this broadly means is the key principles that these pieces of policy guidance tell us is that we should be taking a long-term view, a broad, holistic view of all the risks that we need to manage and accommodate. That we need to undertake adaptive management, so we don't want to sort of undertake static, inflexible management. We want, wherever possible, to be taking an adaptation approach. Wherever possible, we want to work with natural processes. So that means at the coast, that means allowing natural coastal erosion to play its role within the function of the overall natural coastline. Use a combination of instruments, and that's sort of partly what I'm talking to you about today, in terms of instruments at a national level, but also the local planning policy instruments, which Rhys from Cornwall Council is going to talk to you about after me. Participatory planning. This is participatory planning, to my mind. This is getting the community together to ensure that what we do and how we respond to pressures like sea level rise in vulnerable coastal communities encompasses the community's views, and that it's driven by what the community would like to see. But importantly, within the framework of what we can do legally. And that's why I think it's important to set this all out as best I can. And we need to reflect local characteristics. That's the key sort of part of the policy guidance. And coastal change management areas, I'll say a little bit more about those in a minute. So the Environment Agency has a national flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy. We have a legal obligation to produce this strategy. It's one of the things which is set out in that Flood and Water Management Act 2010. It's been endorsed by Parliament. It was formally adopted. So the current version of the strategy was formally adopted in September 2020. The key principles are that it sets out that broad framework for delivering sustainable management of risks, inland and at the coast. And I suppose the most important message to take away in terms of that strategy is it sets a focus on adaptive and resilience. So adaptation and resilience is the key focus for that strategy rather than protection. It doesn't just describe anymore how we sort of just defend the coast and protect the coast. This is talking about how we adapt and respond to climate change. So it encourages all growth to be sustainable. And it prioritises as well this citizen involvement and empowerment. So it talks a lot in there about community involvement and how we engage with people to make sure that we are developing the right solutions. Again, directly relating to what we're doing today. Okay. So shoreline management plans. So some of you will be familiar with the shoreline management plan we've got for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. They start to describe what we're actually going to do at the coast in terms of policy and a plan. And they set out a long-term approach out to 2105, the current policy, the current SMPs. The second generation SMPs were published between 2006 and 2012. The SMP for Cornwall was adopted in 2011. Most important point here, they are mutually owned plans. They're not the plan of the council. They're not the Environment Agency's plan. We work all together. All of the key stakeholders at the coast work together through the coast groups, which bring all of the key stakeholders and decision makers together, and we jointly own these plans and advocate for the policy and the management intent that they describe. So, as I say, Cornwall and Isles of Scilly has that's our local SMP, and the policy choices set out within the Cornwall and Isles of Scilly plan seek to help transition our coastline over that 100-year period using policy choices. But most importantly, it looks to describe and establish a direction of travel which is sustainable, to avoid unsustainable choices and expensive choices that can't be sustained into the future. The key principles that are embedded within Cornwall's plan, obviously to support communities to adapt to climate change and sea level rise. The plan has a long-term action plan associated with it, which sort of identifies all the things we feel we need to do, community by community, to help deliver this long-term plan. It has as one of its key principles to allow natural evolution of the shoreline wherever we can, to support nature conservation values and existing nature conservation designations, and to support public access and to prioritise that and to make sure that we can provide a continuous coastal footpath around the coastway. And importantly, it also recommends where those coastal change management areas might need to be adopted. I'm talking about adaptation. Adaptation pathways is now a sort of a whole management principle, a way of managing risk in its own right. But really important in terms of managing in an adaptive way is that we identify the opportunities that come with that change and that sort of requirement to adapt. We need to understand, all of us, how we best utilise local planning tools like the coastal change management areas and neighbourhood plans to embed the principles that are set out in those high-level pieces of legislation and policy, which have got lots of good words in them, but how do we embed them locally so we can actually get action done? And they support funding as well. And the SMPs need to allow also for that future uncertainty, because the data is going to change. Projections for sea level rise will change and shift over time. So we need to allow for that future uncertainty, avoid locking into unsustainable approaches. And again, they recommend, or we recommend, a very inclusive, community-driven approach and look to bring in our local decision makers, elected officials, to help deliver sustainable management of the coast. Coastal change management areas, I won't dwell on this. Reece is going to talk about that, but we can adopt these at a local area to help heighten the restrictions in terms of what we can and can't do at the coast, and it flags the need to scrutinise development at the coast more closely. You'll have heard about the Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme, possibly CTAP. So recently, £3 million of funding announced for Bude, which follows on from some funding which has been provided to the East Riding of Yorkshire and North Norfolk. And now we've got 3 communities in the southwest which are going to benefit from this Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme funding. And that's really, really exciting, because Bude and the work that we do here in Bude with that £3 million is going to inform, at a national level, approaches to delivering adaptation everywhere else around the coast. So, it's really exciting, and for Bude to have that money, to set itself out as an exemplar community in adapting to coastal change. And it supports a range of measures that we can take, and that includes rolling back, repurposing land, working with finance and property sectors to sort of think of innovative ways to fund investment needed in interventions, and using the local planning system so it supports and facilitates that managed transition. This goes back to the comment on CCMAs and neighbourhood plans. And finally, so this is my last slide. Funding is the big challenge. It's always been the big challenge, funding, but it's worth sort of just pointing out that, we go back to DEFRA's policy statement, which I mentioned on my second slide. It talks about exploring the availability of financial products, services, basically to help communities more effectively transition in the face of rapid coastal change and in areas at high risk of coastal erosion. And that's going to include reviewing those acts, those pieces of legislation, and the powers and responsibilities set out within them. But I think it's really important to sort of note that is being looked at in terms of how do we fund this transition to away from unsustainable coastlines to a more sustainable approach. And again, this can be informed by what we do with the CTAP funding, and how an adaptive change in Bude can be informing national policy. So I've got a red card over there, but that was my last slide. So,
I just had a question.
Yeah.
About the word sustainable. Because you're talking a lot about sustainable management, sustainable development, unsustainable choices, and a lot of the funding is being directed, I think it's at places that can't sustainably deal with climate change. What do you mean when you talk about sustainable development?
So let's put this within the context of the shoreline management planning, which is what we're sort of talking about today. So economically, technically and environmentally are the three sort of pillars that we judge in terms of whether something is sustainable or not. So if we are going to adopt a management approach, building a wall, well then we have to understand, is that sustainable in terms of, so technically, can you actually keep it there? In engineering terms, can you actually build a wall in a place and keep it there, or is it going to just fall down straight away? Or is it going to fall down in 20 years, or is it going to fall down in 70 years? Economically, well, is the funding there to manage that piece of infrastructure, that bit of defence that you've put in for 10 years or 20 years or 50 years? And if it's not into the long term, then it's not seen as economically sustainable. And likewise with the environment, well, does it have unintended or unacceptable implications for environmental quality? Would putting in a piece of defence cause environmental degradation, or the reduction in quality of a designated area? And again, if that's going to be the case, then we can't see it as sustainable. But sustainable means many things to many people, I totally understand.